It started like many televised discussions do, well-paced, polished, and threaded with polite disagreement. Jen Psaki, former White House press secretary turned MSNBC host, sat comfortably behind the desk as the segment turned to the topic of young political voices gaining traction across the country. There was a sense of routine in her tone, the cadence of someone who had done this countless times before. She was in control of the conversation, steering it with ease. That's when Karoline Leavitt's name entered the dialogue. Leavitt, a rising conservative figure known for her articulate, firm stances, had been making headlines for months. At just 27, she had already broken barriers as one of the youngest former Trump White House staffers and a congressional candidate who had proven she could handle the spotlight. But on that particular afternoon, Psaki didn't seem interested in acknowledging the complexity or merit of Leavitt's growing influence. Instead, she offered what many would describe as a backhanded compliment, smoothly delivered but stinging in its undertone. "She's energetic, sure," Psaki said, brushing her notes aside casually, "but parroting talking points doesn't mean you're ready for serious policy discussions." The comment hung in the air, unchallenged by the panelists surrounding her. There was no uproar, no sharp intake of breath. It was subtle, professional, but it was also incredibly telling. This moment wasn't about one personal insult. It was a reflection of something much broader, an ingrained tendency in political media to dismiss younger conservative voices as less legitimate, less thoughtful, and less capable of independent analysis. Psaki's choice of words, parroting, talking points, carried a quiet jab, suggesting that Leavitt wasn't thinking for herself, that she was simply echoing the ideas of others without understanding or originality. What made it more significant was the setting. The media, particularly in mainstream spaces like MSNBC, often positions itself as a gatekeeper of credibility. When someone like Psaki makes a comment like that, it doesn't just come across as a critique of an individual. It signals to viewers that Leavitt, and perhaps others like her, don't belong in the realm of serious conversation. They're labeled as spokespeople for extremism, rather than as contributors to a necessary national dialogue. It was, in many ways, a familiar tactic, one that has long been used to keep political outsiders or non-establishment voices at arm's length. Dismiss their contributions, question their substance, and move on. But what made this moment particularly notable was the underlying irony. Psaki herself had once been one of the youngest press aides in a presidential administration. She had stood at the podium, fielding tough questions, defending policy decisions, and navigating criticism with precision. She knew better than anyone how difficult it was to build credibility at a young age in the high-stakes world of politics. Yet, from her seat at the anchor's desk, she chose to treat Leavitt as if she hadn't earned her place. There's a subtle but persistent double standard in the way young conservatives are treated compared to their progressive counterparts. While liberal voices in their 20s are often celebrated for their boldness, their activism, or their fresh takes on policy, conservative youth are more likely to be portrayed as mouthpieces, too inexperienced to think for themselves, too radical to be taken seriously. This wasn't the first time someone like Leavitt had faced that kind of brush-off. But this time, it was captured live, in real time, by a host with the credibility and poise to make the dismissal seem almost natural. Psaki didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult Leavitt's character. She simply undermined her legitimacy, in a sentence so polished it almost sounded like praise. The power of that moment lay not in its volume, but in its subtlety. It revealed the quiet ways gatekeeping continues to function, through tone, through phrasing, and through the casual certainty of those who believe they define what qualifies as serious political discourse. When the camera shifted to Karoline Leavitt, there was no sign that she had been rattled, no eye roll, no furrowed brow, just a composed, professional smile as she adjusted her posture and waited for her cue. Moments earlier, Jen Psaki had dismissed her as someone simply parroting talking points, suggesting that Leavitt's political views weren't rooted in original thought, but merely echoed from party scripts. It was the kind of comment designed to provoke, not through aggression, but through condescension. And yet, Karoline didn't take the bait. She could have fired back. She had every reason to. The comment wasn't just personal, it was strategic. In the world of televised politics, such remarks are often carefully worded to discredit without overt insult. Psaki didn't call her names. She didn't question her integrity. But by implying Leavitt lacked depth, she sought to undermine her entire political presence in one sentence. It was a subtle form of intellectual gatekeeping. Yet Karoline's response was a masterclass in restraint and clarity. Rather than raising her voice or pointing fingers, she simply leaned forward slightly and said, "Respectfully, Jen, the only reason you're surprised by young conservatives speaking clearly is because for too long, you've only listened to yourselves." There was no sarcasm in her tone, no mockery, just a calm, matter-of-fact sentence that immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation. It wasn't defensive, it was declarative. This kind of poise is rare in today's media climate where outrage often overshadows insight and people rush to out-yell each other. But Leavitt seemed to understand something deeper. That true strength doesn't always show itself in confrontation. It shows in control. She had every tool at her disposal to clap back in the way so many political commentators do, forcefully, with rhetorical heat. But she chose not to, because Karoline wasn't there to trade jabs. She was there to be heard. By staying grounded, she flipped the situation. Psaki's words were designed to suggest that Leavitt didn't belong at the table. But Leavitt's response made it clear that not only did she belong, she had something of substance to contribute. She didn't argue over credentials or attempt to match Psaki's resume. She didn't remind viewers that she had worked in the White House at a younger age than many ever do. Instead, she let her tone and clarity do the work. And that clarity stood in stark contrast to the tone that had preceded her. Where Psaki had offered critique wrapped in passive language, Leavitt delivered a direct insight without hostility. It wasn't just a response, it was a reframing, a subtle way of saying, "I see what you're doing and I'm not playing by that rule book." The reaction online was almost immediate, not because Leavitt had owned anyone or issued a takedown, but because she had shown that composure could cut deeper than conflict. People noticed the difference. She wasn't flustered. She didn't retaliate with a rehearsed soundbite. She spoke like someone who didn't need to prove herself to anyone in that room. In doing so, she revealed the real weight of Psaki's earlier comment. By not reacting emotionally, she exposed the smallness of the insult. She let it sit there, unreturned, and then stepped right over it. That approach matters, especially for someone like Karoline Leavitt, who represents a younger generation of conservatives often portrayed as too aggressive or too ideological. By refusing to match stereotype with stereotype, she made a stronger case for herself than any fiery rebuttal could have. She showed that you can hold strong beliefs and still carry yourself with balance. That disagreement doesn't have to lead to derision. And that confidence doesn't require theatrics. What Leavitt demonstrated in that moment wasn't just media savvy, it was maturity. The kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The kind that changes minds not through volume. The sentence wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It didn't carry the cadence of a rehearsed zinger, nor was it followed by the kind of dramatic pause meant to provoke applause. But when Karoline Leavitt calmly said, "Respectfully, Jen, the only reason you're surprised by young conservatives speaking clearly is because for too long you've only listened to yourselves," the conversation changed. It was, by most standards, a quiet moment, but it hit like a reset button. Up until that point, the exchange had been predictable. Jen Psaki, poised and practiced behind the desk, had done what many in her position do when faced with someone outside their ideological circle. She framed Karoline not as an individual thinker, but as a reflection of a broader, simplified narrative. A talking head. Someone who checked off the boxes of partisan alignment, but lacked the independent judgment to stand on her own. In a sense, Psaki's comment wasn't really meant for Leavitt. It was meant for the audience, to subtly discredit her before she even spoke. But Leavitt, rather than taking offense or diving into an argument, replied with one sentence that forced the conversation into a completely different gear. It was a mirror held up, not just to Psaki, but to a media environment that too often treats dissenting voices as noise rather than nuance. Her sentence didn't attack. It pointed out. It drew attention to an echo chamber without naming it outright. The brilliance wasn't in its cleverness, it was in its truth. Because the reality is, for years, many mainstream media spaces have operated in ideological loops, reinforcing their own narratives while dismissing others as fringe, uninformed, or reactionary. When a young conservative like Karoline enters the conversation with composure and clarity, it doesn't fit the script, and that alone can be jarring. The way she phrased it, "For too long you've only listened to yourselves," was deliberate. It didn't accuse Psaki of bad faith. It didn't suggest media bias in the way people are used to hearing it, which often leads to instant defensiveness. Instead, it made a simple observation that resonated with a broader audience, including those who might not have even agreed with Leavitt politically. It touched on something many Americans quietly feel, that political conversations have become too insular, too self-congratulatory, and too disconnected from people who don't share the prevailing view in certain media circles. Leavitt's sentence reframed the moment. Instead of being on defense, forced to prove she wasn't just parroting talking points, she gently turned the spotlight back onto Psaki's own assumptions. And in doing so, she challenged something more than just a personal jab. She challenged the framework itself. There was power in the fact that she didn't linger on it. She said her piece and then moved forward, talking about education, about energy, about economic opportunity for younger generations. Her goal wasn't to win a moment. It was to make a point and then keep going. That subtle shift in tone, rejecting the temptation to turn the exchange into a spectacle, made the sentence all the more effective. It wasn't a spike in a debate. It was a reset in tone. And as often happens with moments like these, it was the viewers who felt the shift first. Clips of that one sentence began circulating, not just among conservative audiences, but in broader circles. Commentators noted the irony. In trying to minimize Leavitt's contribution, Psaki had unintentionally set the stage for a defining moment, one that made Leavitt appear thoughtful, composed, and genuinely independent in her thinking. She had, with one line, addressed the real issue. Not that young conservatives can't think for themselves, but that some simply refuse to recognize it when they do. And she did it without raising her voice or demanding respect. She earned it by the way she carried herself. In an era when political conversation so often leans on sound bites and overstatements, Leavitt's one sentence was remarkably free of both. It was a clear signal that she wasn't there to mimic the usual patterns. She was there to shift them. Karoline Leavitt didn't need to win the moment with a verbal knockout. She didn't need to out-talk Jen Psaki or rattle off a list of credentials. What made her response resonate so widely was precisely the way she didn't fight. Instead, she chose influence over intensity. That one calm, composed sentence. "Respectfully, Jen, the only reason you're surprised by young conservatives speaking clearly is because for too long, you've only listened to yourselves." Didn't come from a place of personal grievance. It came from conviction. And that made all the difference. It would have been easy for Leavitt to meet condescension with fire. Jen Psaki's earlier comment, branding Leavitt as someone who simply parrots talking points, was delivered in a casually dismissive tone. It wasn't meant to start a shouting match, but it was meant to diminish her. On live television, that kind of slight contempt even seasoned voices into immediate pushback. But Leavitt chose a different path. She wasn't on that panel to trade political barbs. She was there to talk policy, to offer ideas, and to represent a new generation of conservatives who aren't interested in theatrics. Her sentence landed because it didn't try to win over the room with noise. It simply asked people to listen differently. And they did. Viewers leaned in. Not because she attacked Psaki, but because she calmly pointed out something many hadn't noticed until it was named. That political conversations, especially in legacy media spaces, too often recycle the same voices, the same assumptions, and the same dismissive attitudes toward those who don't fit the mold. Leavitt challenged that, without being confrontational. She didn't try to dominate the screen, she just spoke plainly, and in doing so, changed the energy of the discussion. The what moment became a contrast in communication styles. Psaki, a skilled communicator herself, had defaulted to an insider's tone, one that often works in closed circles but doesn't always translate well beyond them. Leavitt, on the other hand, came across as someone speaking not just to the panel but to the people watching at home, the ones tired of the noise, the ones eager to hear substance without spin. She reminded everyone that political discourse doesn't have to be combative to be impactful. There was a kind of quiet authority in her voice, something that doesn't always get credited in political commentary. Too often, we reward the loudest or the most theatrical. But what Leavitt demonstrated is that influence comes from how you speak, not just what you say. She didn't lecture, and she didn't gloat. She delivered her sentence like it was just a fact, a moment of clarity delivered, without fanfare. It wasn't just about scoring points, it was about shifting the narrative. That sentence reframed how people were looking at the moment, not as a rising conservative being outclassed by a seasoned host, but as a young, thoughtful voice refusing to be boxed in by old expectations. She didn't ask for respect. She showed why she deserved it. After the exchange, Leavitt didn't circle back to Psaki's insult. She moved on, calmly discussing her views on education, freedom of speech, and the economic pressures facing young Americans. That choice, to steer the conversation back toward real issues, was part of what gave her response lasting power. It wasn't about personal victory. It was about making space for a more honest kind of dialogue. And that's why the moment stuck. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Leavitt proved that composure, paired with clarity, can be more persuasive than any performance. She didn't need to silence anyone to be heard. She simply spoke in a way that made it impossible to ignore her. In a political climate where debates often turn into shouting matches and nuance is hard to find, Leavitt's response stood out. It reminded people that conviction doesn't require confrontation, and that sometimes the most powerful statement is the one delivered with calm certainty. Karoline Leavitt's appearance on that broadcast may have started as just another media segment, but by the end, it had become something more. An unexpected moment that challenged assumptions, shifted tone, and left a lasting impression far beyond the studio walls. She didn't come in with the goal of making headlines. She didn't need a mic drop. What made her stand out was her ability to cut through the noise without adding to it. When Psaki delivered her subtle dismissal, many might have expected the typical response: frustration, defensiveness, or a war of words. But Karoline offered none of that. Instead, she answered with one poised, thoughtful sentence that quietly turned the conversation upside down. Respectfully, Jen, the only reason you're surprised by young conservatives speaking clearly is because for too long you've only listened to yourselves. In that moment, she didn't just defend herself. She exposed a larger truth about the echo chambers that often shape political discourse. It wasn't about age. It wasn't even entirely about ideology. It was about a mindset that assumes anyone outside of a certain narrative must be uninformed, incapable, or simply mimicking others. Leavitt broke that assumption with grace. She didn't force people to agree with her. She made them reconsider how they were listening in the first place. And she didn't stop there. After delivering her now viral response, she moved the conversation toward policy, speaking clearly and confidently on the issues she believed mattered to everyday Americans. She didn't dwell on the insult or turn the moment into a personal showdown. That choice alone set her apart. It showed that her goal wasn't to win a single moment, it was to represent something broader, a generation that's often talked about but rarely taken seriously. Leavitt's poise reminded viewers that strength in political dialogue doesn't have to come from outrage. Sometimes the most influential voices are the ones who don't shout, but simply speak with clarity, self-awareness, and resolve. In a space where many come prepared with rehearsed sound bites and defensive postures, Leavitt brought a different kind of presence, one rooted in self-confidence rather than self-promotion. It's easy to overlook a moment like this. After all, no one yelled, no one stormed off, and there were no theatrics. But maybe that's exactly why it struck such a chord. Because in that calm exchange, viewers saw something rare, an honest confrontation with the status quo, delivered not with anger, but with a quiet insistence on being heard. In the end, Karoline Leavitt didn't need to prove anything to Jen, Psaki, or anyone else on that panel. Her words, her tone, and her ability to remain grounded did the work for her. She didn't just answer an insult, she rewrote the narrative. And for many watching, that was the